Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this event that is organized by Sciences Po Chair on Sovereign Debt, a chair that is affiliated to the Paris School of International Affairs, in what we hope will be the first in a series of events leading to the summit on a new global financial pact that President Macron has convened here in France, 22nd and 23rd of June, to talk about the challenges around debt management, financing poverty eradication, which is the target number one we have as a global community, managing the energy and climate transition, managing the technological revolution. So how can we finance these huge transitions that the world is facing, and how can countries that are extremely indebted do that? And we are launching the series with Achim Steiner. He is the administrator of the UN Development Program. So the heart, the engine of the UN system, the engine that works to precisely get every country to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Achim needs no introduction, but I'm just going to give you a few snippets of what he has done before joining us here today. He has had a long career in the United Nations, served as head of UN Environmental Program, UNEP, head of the UN office in Nairobi. Before that, Director General of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So you can see that there is a big stream there of climate and sustainability. He's also been the director of the Oxford Martin School. So he loves talking to students and engaging with the students. So don't hesitate. And today he's going to talk to us about the challenges around managing debt. And before we hear from Achim, I want to introduce Anne-Laure Kichel. Anne-Laure is the founder of Global Sovereign Advisory. It's a company here in France, in Paris, that is advising governments on their financial and strategic issues, and who is the sponsor of the chair on sovereign debt at SIA. So without further ado, we would have loved to have Anne-Laure with us today, but she is in the UN in New York, just as the UN New York comes to Paris. So you can see that this family is big, and it doesn't matter the location, but we're all working towards the same goal. So Anne-Laure, let me turn the floor to you for a few remarks before we hear from Achim.
Thank you very much, Achim. It's a pleasure to be with you all. So good afternoon and warm welcome to this very important conference on breaking the cycle of debt crisis. I'm indeed speaking from the UN headquarters, as this week holds the plenary of the Committee for Development body, which kind of like amongst others advise ECOSOC on policy matters and is responsible for the graduation process of the least developed countries. As you can imagine, that has been at the center of our discussion. And I really like to take this opportunity to stress the contribution of the United Nations to the global debt dialogue. And it's a very welcomed contribution, as it has become so polarized. And I'm sure you will touch upon this in the discussion. I just would like to remind that when we launched on sovereign debt with Sciences Po in 2019, our aim was to foster cross-disciplinary approach to sovereign debt research, bringing together contribution from economists, scholars, sociologists, academics, and practitioners. These cross-disciplinaries become even more important as we face for a wave of probably debt distress events in low-income countries. And the recent debates that we've been seeing in Zambia, Sri Lanka, Suriname, Malawi illustrates how sovereign debt issues are not just about debt, but about economic, legal, geopolitical, fiscal discussions. I'd like to stress the importance of the discussion today because developing countries are facing with a challenging situation where a lot of external debt dynamics have substantially deteriorated because of the multi-crisis environment we're living in, not just COVID, the war, of course, in Ukraine, but unfortunately, probably many more crises or shocks to come. And it makes it very harder to service their debt. We expect that 60% of low-income countries now stand or are at high risk of debt distress, which is a sharp increase from the situation before the pandemic. So this is also a new situation we have to be facing with. So in this situation, what is very clear is that the architecture, the current of the sovereign debt restructuring is not 100% fit for the purpose, because clearly the restructuring processes are not getting fast enough, and they're getting entrenched into some geopolitical situation. It's also being entrenched between discussions between public actors and private actors. So there is probably need to somehow rethink this whole process with a much more integrated approach along the lines and involving everybody upfront as much as one can. Just maybe as an example to show this, Chad, which kind of like successfully completed its restructuring under the common framework. But it took a long time, and actually during the time of the negotiation, the oil price kind of like moved substantially, making the restructuring change along the line of this whole process. And at the same time, the result that one is now facing with is that Chad has limited financing capacities. To say very clearly, they cannot borrow if it's not concessional money, which makes it extremely challenging for them to meet some of their very essential goals, and one of them is access to water. In some part of Chad, you only have access, people have only access, 20% of people have access to water, which is, of course, completely unacceptable. But how do you do this if you have to have high technology means in order to address this? With private sector involvement, it probably requires not just concessional financing. So how do you deal with this in a very particular case such as Chad? So clearly there are many topics we can be discussing on this architecture. I, however, would like to say that there has been some recent initiative, and the sovereign debt table that the IMF has put forward is clearly a good initiative to try to have people around the table. I hope it will kind of like allow everybody to contribute in a much more meaningful way, and that it will also bring new debt instruments that are more fitted to country purposes. And when I say more fitted to country purposes, it's quick reaction when there are crises, so immediate disbursement, and also easy to use instruments, because a lot of time you have money committed to countries, but the actual disbursements takes a long time to happen because it has a lot of conditionalities, because countries don't really know how to deal with those conditionalities. So there is probably something around simplification, which doesn't mean that you should not control, but simplify things, that probably is something that may be very useful to be thinking about. So I could go on a lot with many ideas. I just also want to mention, of course, the Bridgetown initiative, that is also a very important component of what we need to be thinking through. Because when we think about debt, okay, there is financial debt, it's very clear, but there's also environmental debt. And how do you keep for developed countries who have definitely used those resources, and lower income countries who have not used these resources, but are faced with the consequences of what has been done? So there needs to be a compensation mechanism. It needs to be organized. Is it through the loss and damages fund? Can we work on building a carbon credit market that would work? All those ideas are on the table, and it's extremely important that it's being monetized and actionable, not just a concept for those countries. So again, thank you all, and I look forward to a very fruitful discussion today between the Sciences Po faculty, you students, and of course, Achim Steiner. And thanks again for Sciences Po for organizing this.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne-Laure, for this curtain raiser. And now, Achim, floor to you.
Thank you very much, Dean. Thank you, Anne-Laure, also for this very valuable introduction, and good afternoon to the Sciences Po community. My name is Achim Steiner. As the Dean has introduced me, I have the strangest title in the United Nations. I'm called the Administrator. And just to reassure you, I'm not going to hold a lecture about accounting this afternoon management of our books, but I'm going to try and address precisely the areas in which you, Arantxa, just now, and also Hannelore, have begun to point to as essentially economic and financial Achilles heels that are not just material to our global economy and our financial system. They translate directly into the risks that, particularly at the Paris School of International Affairs, but also in many other disciplines, I hope you on your studies. Because one thing is for certain, and I don't need to tell you this in detail, we live in very strange times. We live in times of distress, of disruption, of uncertainty. And it sort of reminds me that during the financial crisis, there was a time when we talked about we live in financial times. That was actually the FT's headline one day, to co-brand itself with, the great Main Street dilemmas of 2008 and 2009. And then we lived in pandemic times, and we thought, well, it can't really get much worse than that. And now we live in a essentially global economic disruption that is driven by, the war in Ukraine and its impacts on food markets, on energy markets, on financial markets. And yes, we live in times where war and conflict, not just in Ukraine, but actually globally, are reaching maximum levels since 1945. More than 100 million people, as we sit here tonight, are either refugees or internally displaced people around the world today. This is the highest number since the Second World War. To anyone who doubts that this is a traumatic moment, you don't only have to look at how in our political arenas this is manifesting itself, whether you live in France or the United States, or whether you live virtually in any country around the world. Already before the pandemic, we saw that our societies are increasingly facing, let's say, the marginalization on the one hand of those who are being left behind, and the political polarization in terms of where traditionally our societies would converge in order to solve problems. Right now, we find ourselves increasingly in societies that are diverging because they lose confidence in the very institutions that are meant to solve problems for us. What I'm going to speak to you about tonight is essentially the point in time where the international financial architecture that was built up after 1945, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, but frankly speaking, our entire financial system is increasingly broken. And to some of you, this may sound strange because it's the richest moment in human history. Our total wealth is somewhere around $450 trillion. But that's precisely the first question you have to ask yourself. So if we are the richest generation in human history, at least in financial terms, why on earth are there so many poor people? Why on earth are we not able to come up with $100 billion to, for example, meet the commitment that rich nations made in the Paris Agreement? And this was 2015. In fact, it was even before then that this pledge was made. And here we are in the year 2023, and the wealthiest nations have not even been able to meet a commitment of co-financing the developing world's accelerated transition towards a more decarbonized future. And I could go on. We are also in the midst of and this will be a partial focus of my comments this evening to you, in the midst of an economic and financial crisis that already is beginning to show how even as a global nations we are on a divergent path. Europe and North America and Japan and perhaps a few of the emerging or more industrialized economies are already beginning to sit back because maybe things will not be quite as bad as we thought. They're not getting better, but as Kristalina Georgieva put it, they're just not getting as bad as we thought they would. And this is the beginning of 2023. But for many people across the world, things are getting bad and worse by the day. And when I speak to you largely through what may seem at first a fairly narrow lens of economic and financial developments, rest assured that the way they translate into political economy, into politics, into society, is direct, immediate, and highly disruptive. What I also want to try and do with you this evening is to encourage you, because you are the generation that will leave this institution and has the possibility of having learned from amongst the best, but also hopefully learned not to accept that which you are taught on face value. Economics is often a discipline, and I speak as an economist, that is sort of almost a science. Well, I would argue that it is far from a science, and anybody who suggests that it is a science is creating a false identity for a subject that is ultimately about understanding human behavior, and secondly about formulating choices. So what I'm presenting to you tonight is in the face of an escalating economic and financial crisis with significant repercussions, particularly for the developing world, that we need to shed existing paradigms. We need to challenge them. We need to also challenge dogmas that for so long have made the financial and economic discourse of a transatlantic view of the world really something that left far too many people behind, and right now is impoverishing literally tens of millions of people. Why do I say that? Well, let's be, in a sense, very pragmatic and practical. We are at a moment in time where we just managed in the richest nations to turn everything that we knew about economics and finance upside down. In the midst of a pandemic, suddenly, the wealthiest nations were able to mobilize $16 trillion in terms of a stimulus package. Most of us didn't even know that you could spend $1 trillion in any country or economy. And here we found ourselves in a world where perfectly rational decisions were being taken at levels of public expenditure and borrowing that would have been considered just a few years ago the end of an economy. How is it possible? Well, because in crisis, we suddenly discover that financial engineering and economics are in fact not the equivalent of the laws of physics. This is not a science where you can exactly predict what happens next when you do something. And that is not to in any way minimize the, let's say, econometric and modeling skills of economists. We rely on them every day to anticipate market reactions. But frankly, if you look at all the crises we are living through just in the last 100 years, how often have the models and the financial and economic experts completely failed us in either predicting those crises properly or in providing adequate responses of how to get out of those crises? And that's not to question that there are tools we can use. Quantitative easing was another fascinating example of how suddenly central banks could simply make markets more liquid because liquidity was urgently needed. So, when I speak to you tonight about the dilemma we face, let me try and give it a little bit more of a real face. And I want to share 3 data points with you. First of all, in this report that we have released this afternoon, it's a UNDP report you will find on our website, Building Blocks Out of the Crisis, the UN Secretary General's SDGs stimulus plan, which he released last week, takes a number of essentially data points that Hannah also referred to just now. First of all, in our latest estimation, 52 developing countries now face debt distress. And as I said to some, well, to the macroeconomists that look at global financial markets, maybe these 52 countries represent 3 to 5% of global GDP. So should we really be worried about it? This is how macroeconomists, how essentially global financial experts look at the world. Is this material in terms of its risk to the rest of us? Well, maybe not, except, as I will come to back later, when a country goes into debt distress, when it suddenly defaults, then the next thing that happens is that politics, society, government, basic services start collapsing. We have seen this, Sri Lanka just being the latest example. Other countries, including countries such as Pakistan, now facing severe balance of payments challenges, maybe just 3 weeks of reserves left in terms of foreign exchange. This is a nation of 200 million people. But you know what? It's not the 3 to 5% that should matter to us. It is the fact that in these 52 countries that I'm citing to you right now and that you will see described here in more detail, 40% of the world's poorest people live. Out of those 52, 25 of the most climate vulnerable nations are a group of countries. When you begin to interrogate the vulnerability and also the volatility that is implied by these societies now facing essentially a situation where they may no longer be able to pay the interest and certainly not repay their international debt, it de facto means they are excluded from, first of all, borrowing more, and ultimately may not have any more money left to even buy, for instance, the import of diesel and petrol, medicines, food. All of that happened in Sri Lanka just a few months ago. A second data point of how serious the debt crisis has become. And remember, this is on the back of a pandemic and now a cost of living crisis and a global economy that has the ripple effects of the war in Ukraine compounding already many underlying conditions, as it is called. 25 countries today spend 20% of their government revenue just on debt servicing, 1/5 of a government's income just on servicing the debt. And if you look at it more through the lens of financial markets, sovereign bond yields today above 10% for a growing number of countries, above 10% of what US Treasury yields are, which in established financial wisdom means you can no longer borrow on the financial markets. And believe me, these are not only the countries that we might refer to as crisis countries. Could it be Libya? Could it be Yemen? Could it be Somalia? Because there is already a severe economic stressful reality at play. No, these are established countries with, in a sense, very resilient economies just a few years ago. Ghana facing suddenly an immediate crisis. Countries such as Kenya, at certain points in the last few months, exceeding that 10-point spread, and therefore, in essence, being locked out of the capital markets. Yet, at a moment in time where there's an explosion in the cost of energy imports, food security is threatened, and debt servicing is exploding because interest rates now are, for many of these developing countries, not at 4 or 5%, no, but at 10, 12, 14%, which is essentially prohibitive in terms of an economy. So when the Secretary General steps forward in front of the world and now says, we have to do something about it, the national financial architecture is broken, or as Hannah put it, the current debt architecture is not fit for purpose, this is a polite way of saying, Houston, we have a problem. And that problem, unfortunately, is being viewed at from very different vantage points, and depending on where you sit in the world, this is either a small problem or it is a fundamental problem to your future economic prospects. The Secretary General has proposed that we should, at the moment in this crisis, recognize that in a world where total wealth, and I remind you of this because that's the context in which we need to look at these numbers, total global wealth is around $430 to $470 trillion. Trillion dollars, mind you. To argue for a $500 billion stimulus in the midst of this crisis, and I just gave you a few data points of what is happening at the moment to much of the population, because remember, if you just take, for example, an area that takes you from China to Vietnam, essentially that triangle includes India, half of the world's population lives there. You go to Africa, the next 1.5 billion are living there. These are the center grounds of where this economic and financial reality is playing out, and it is the vast majority of the world's peoples. In that attempt to try and find a stimulus, let me now reassure you, what is being proposed by the Secretary General is not to have taxpayers find $500 billion in extra money in order to help these countries. We all know that that is both politically and economically very unlikely. But what the Secretary General is calling for is essentially a new international financial architecture, a Bretton Woods order that must ensure that finance is systematically aligned and invested in a more just, inclusive, and equitable development of countries around the world. And the building blocks out of the crisis report, which we launched here today, provides that more granular data on the stimulus. And to those of you who obviously may have more experience with debt, you should obviously find within this report a lot of detail that will illustrate to you, first of all, how this debt in every country looks different. For instance, if you open the newspapers nowadays, you think that the biggest creditor in the world is China. This is sort of the common wisdom. China is the new creditor problem in our global economic context. Few of you will realize that actually you need to unpack this because, in fact, contrary to the previous debt crisis in the 1990s, the majority of today is private sector held debt, and that is largely transatlantic debt. It's the banks, the hedge funds, the pension funds that are essentially the creditors of a significant amount of private capital, in fact 60% of global debt, roughly, from what we know. And it is as a result of having been encouraged for years now by the international financial institutions. Developing countries must borrow on the world's capital markets. They must use private capital because there isn't enough ODA and there certainly isn't enough concessional funding. So they did. And here we are in a world where 60% of the debt that we are aware of is held by the private sector. And you then look at sovereign debt. Certainly China is now one of the most prominent providers of sovereign debt, but so is the World Bank for LDCs, because in fact in least developed countries or low-income countries, they are not the ones who can go to the capital market. They borrow from the World Bank, they borrow from IFD or from KfW. They are in a sense indebted in a very different structure. So we need to find different tools to address this. Our most important message just now is that we cannot solve the debt crisis through just relief parachuting in from rich countries. This is not a short-term problem. In fact, we are looking at a far more fundamental way in which, as the Secretary General has called for, one, injecting liquidity into our global economy, because for many developing countries there is no fiscal space left right now. Remember, they are still coming out of the pandemic in economic and social terms. Secondly, to restructure sovereign debt in particular. When France lends money, when the World Bank lends money, we now need to restructure this debt because it is simply not sustainable. And this is, in a sense, evidence that we already had from the 1990s, when precisely the HIPC initiative, some of you may have come across this term for highly indebted countries, was one of the responses. And thirdly, we need to lower the longer-term cost of borrowing, or rather the cost of borrowing by spreading it over longer periods. These calls by the Secretary General translate into some very practical recommendations where we are essentially able to leverage tens of billions, sometimes even hundreds of billions of dollars that we can free up, so to speak, for countries to invest in development. Let me give you two examples. Our latest analysis projects that a 30% haircut of debt stock. To those who may not be familiar with haircut, it's obviously not the coiffeur. It's what banks do when they kind of just take a slash of the debt. Could free up, and please listen to this number, $148 billion in foregone debt service payments. Private creditors are ready for debt-distressed countries trading debt stock or bonds that are in distressed economies at a write-off of around 50%. So for the private sector, this is actually not an unattractive way of dealing with a haircut. And, you know, when they are trading these distressed bonds at 40 to 50 cents to the dollar, a 30% haircut is actually a very interesting deal, which is also why private creditors are finally coming to the table, because one of the ironies of the last 24 months through the pandemic and following the pandemic is that the so-called London Club, where private creditors meet, not physically, but in a virtual sense, as opposed to the Paris Club with public debtors or creditors, they refused to come to the table. They simply did not want to be part of addressing this issue, which is why in the year 2023, we now have a debt crisis. Our financial system is geared in such a way that the interests of the majority of the world's people are simply subjugated to the short-term interests of financial markets that have the leverage to set the agenda. And what does this mean? So here we are in 2023, and we now have a debt problem in which taxpayers are, in a sense, having to step in because it is becoming unmanageable. We also estimate that if 40% of the new financing was done at near concessional rates, i.e. the rates at which a World Bank, for example, would lend money to developing countries, economies could save another $120 billion in foregone interest rate payments. It essentially means that we use these international financial institutions to do what they were set up for, which is to provide, because of their AAA rating, the ability to borrow at the rates that a AAA rating provides you with, also with the guarantees that are provided by the shareholders of those institutions, and then lend that money on to developing countries, not at what financial markets would punitively lend it to them for, 10, 12, 14%, but at 4%. And you know, it's almost like magic. Suddenly you have created fiscal space to the tune of $120 billion in interest rates that developing countries would not have to pay. This is not black magic. This is not sorcery. This is actually taking the international financial architecture to task and beginning to say the way we are managing our global economy right now is a reflection of a deeply unjust and increasingly divisive and ultimately also prone to failure financial system. To just give you another example of how simple one can sometimes bring more capital into our global economy, one of the few, and some would say only, real meaningful developments during the pandemic was when the IMF issued the special drawing rights. Billions of dollars were introduced into the global financial system. I won't bore you now with the technicalities of this, but no French person, no British person, no German paid an extra dollar of tax in order to finance hundreds of billions of SDRs, as they are called. They were injected into the global economy and essentially provide vital liquidity. Another way in which you can use these balance sheets also is, for instance, the World Bank. Few realize that the paid-in capital that the World Bank actually has from its shareholders is only $20 billion. With that, it is able to lend over $200 billion. So if we were to simply double the paid-in capital of the World Bank, $40 billion, the World Bank would most likely be able to lend over $400 billion instead of $200 billion a year to developing countries. So I hope I've given you at least a sufficient sense of confidence that when we talk in dimensions that for most of us just a few years ago would have been unimaginable, this is the reality of a global community of nations, either finding a way to come together to tackle these immediate problems or of drifting apart further. And if you allow me, Arantxa, I will close by just making a couple of concluding remarks. The technicalities of a HIPIC initiative and a Brady Bond as a way of trying to address debt restructuring right now is something that some of you will be familiar with. Others need to know that it's been done before, that it worked before, and we need an adapted version on a far larger scale right now. But perhaps more importantly is that what we are proposing here, I'm taking tomorrow to Bangalore, where the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors are meeting. I am the United Nations representative to the finance track of the G20, and my task, together with my colleagues, will be to try and persuade finance ministers to not simply raise their eyebrows and say, no, this is far too complex. This is not what we do. We do short-term crisis management, because sadly, that is where the G20 has excelled. But actually, this is a short-term problem with major long-term consequences if it's not addressed. Mia Motley, I understand, was here just a few months ago or weeks ago and addressed you. Minister with her Bridgetown initiative. Janet Yellen with her World Bank reform agenda. President Macron with his finance summit this June. If you're looking for data points of in how many different offices and strategic institutions around the world red lights are flashing that Houston, we have a problem, then just take a few of these and you will understand why the topic that I'm addressing today is not just about finance. It's not just about economics. In fact, for me, what we're discussing here is in many ways symptomatic for, but also causally related to where our world is simply getting it wrong. We are facing an unprecedented challenge. Some already argue that when you take climate change science, we have passed the point of staying within a 1.5 degree scenario. what on earth is wrong with our world when we can find the resources to actually invest, and I use the term deliberately, co-invest in developing countries' ability to make energy transitions happen faster, to allow decarbonization not to constrain development, but actually to accelerate development opportunities. And yet here we are, climate conference after conference. And I particularly point at the G7 countries, incapable of mobilizing $100 billion as a co-investment in helping developing countries who at every COP are being asked to jump ever higher, ever faster, in order to change their energy systems, because otherwise the rest of the world will not stay within the 1.5 degree. Do you appreciate what it means to be a developing country in today's global economy? Are you surprised how many of them now come to climate conferences not to negotiate how to move faster forward, but rather how to protect themselves in an increasingly contradictory and some would say hypocritical environment? The reality is that the world of the future is decarbonized. I think anybody who doubts that is misreading all the signs that are there. The energy revolution has already begun. Here alone, $380 billion were invested in green energy around the world. Do you know how much of that was actually invested on the African continent? 13 billion, less than 5%. This is what's wrong with our global financial economy. This is what's wrong with our global climate policy. This is wrong when the political economy of development gets entrapped in the interests of those who are always asking others to do more and are not to step up to essentially invest, not pay, invest their fair share. And that is why you see a Secretary General now challenging the world's international financial system, challenging the G7 and the G20 to finally recognize the dysfunctionality of our international financial system, which is essentially not inevitably impoverishing tens of millions of people right now, but in the way that we allow it to operate is doing exactly that. And that is why I sit here in front of you today as the head of the United Nations Development Program, because a few years ago it became crystal clear to me that unless we can address the issue of financing of development in a contemporary and more equitable and just way, we will neither succeed in eradicating poverty, nor will we succeed as a global family of now 8 billion people in realizing the promise of the Paris Agreement. Sustainable development in the 21st century could be, as Lord Nicholas Stern put it, the greatest growth story of human history. At the moment, we are catastrophically messing it up for reasons that have nothing to do with the science of how our societies function, nor our economies function, nor our markets function. It is choices being made by those who don't have to pay the price that ultimately allows them to make those choices because others pay that price. And that is why the discussion about debt, our international financial architecture, belongs right in the center of our international multilateral system. It is the only place where different interests at least have the right to articulate their own interests and reality, and maybe out of that we will, as we have done in human history, learn lessons that ultimately we live in an age where the idea that as big an economy as you might think of yourself, you can't solve these issues on your own. And that is why 2023 is a year in which I hope you will, in a sense, take not just the pessimism and the frustrations about what is happening in our world, but rather the courage and the energy to challenge dogma, existing paradigms, the status quo, and damn well help to move this system along. Thank you.
Wow. Wow, that was a tour de force. So, 3 messages. Question: received wisdom. Number 2, we're not looking for short-term fixes. We are looking for system change. And number 3, finance debt beyond finance ministries, beyond finance ministers, and beyond finance and economics. These are the 3 messages that we've heard today. Floor now is to you. You've got microphones on both sides of the room. As usual, you go to the mic, you briefly introduce yourself, and then you put your question to Achim. We will start over there.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for your speech. It was very passionate, and I enjoy it personally. My name is Amanda. I'm from China. I have two questions, actually. One is responding to your speech that you're saying the private sector is now so present, where a lot of wealth is lying, and the debt creditors, like 60% are them. So in your strategy, how do you envision to mobilize them? The second question is, as youth, we are not yet in the decision-making sphere, let's say, on the global platforms. What's your advice on what we do at this very moment to contribute to this plan, essentially? Thank you.
Thank you. Achim is over to you.
You want me to respond?
Yeah, one.
Right. Well, thank you for the question. And, you know, the private sector, in some ways, often, particularly in a sort of transatlantic paradigm of, you know, free markets and capitalism, often viewed as best left alone to find the, let's say, outcomes, as economists would say, Pareto optimum. But you know what history has taught us is that in no society does the private sector operate in a completely anarchic context, whether it was in the way that markets ran 500 years ago, in the way that we legislate financial markets today, or we legislate the digital universe that is, you know, at the moment emerging in a way where regulatory ability to provide guardrails for how a new technology becomes part of our society. I think even if you go to Davos for the last 5 to 10 years, you would be surprised how much the private sector actually calls for regulation, regulatory frameworks. So the first point is, do not view an optimal, you know, operating environment of the private sector in the old Milton Friedman sense of the less state, the better the outcome for society. Because clearly that hasn't worked. And it's not also the reality, because if you look at the energy transitions, for instance, that are underway today, they are a way in which public interest and public policy is translated into incentives or into removing distortions. I'm very passionate about subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies. Some of you may even have heard about a dinosaur that we released into the General Assembly Hall, Frankie the Dino, a couple of years ago. Kind of rattled people into understanding that what we call fossil fuel subsidies, which are at the moment around $600 billion a year, each one of those dollars is essentially subsidizing either the energy industry to produce more fossil fuels, i.e. drill further and farther and more expensive places, or subsidizing consumers. If you remove those subsidies, you don't even have to do a lot, because renewable energy today in many economies is per kilowatt hour far more competitive than oil, gas, or certainly nuclear. Sorry, we are in France, and it's a debate that I know people will conduct with passion. But I mean, given the current, let's say, price curves, you can see for reactors in the UK, in which France is also involved, but also in Finland, where France was not involved as far as I remember, none of these reactors are built for less than 2 to 3 times of their original cost estimate, and they are years behind. Now look at a country like China. In China, it wasn't necessarily the private sector, it was a regulatory and public policy decision to invest heavily into renewable energy technology. But in India, right now, the government is committed to, by the year 2030, to install over 480,000 megawatts of renewable energy or electricity generating infrastructure. Most of that financed through the private sector, by private investors. Because a good regulatory environment gives certainty, gives the incentives, the economics is aligned, and you move forward. So, regulatory policy, smart regulatory policy that corrects for distortions, provides incentives, as for instance, the German economy did when it provided the, you know, how do you say that in English? The energy subsidy initially for allowing people to invest their money in renewable energy infrastructure. Interesting enough, after 4 years, Germany was heavily criticized because the response was so overwhelming that they were actually locked into paying people far too much money for investing in renewable energy, and they had to remove them because they couldn't actually accommodate the amount of energy infrastructure was being installed. So we learn lessons. Public regulators are not always the smartest. But right now, if your target is to move fast towards renewable energy infrastructure, you have to create the incentives for the private sector to either overcome its hesitation or its risk perceptions. The revenue ultimately will bring a market with it, and I think this is where we are. Now, on the issue of debt, as I said to you, right now the private sector is very much becoming part of the debt management picture because its own projected losses from countries defaulting means that 40 to 50 cents out of a dollar of their bonds or loans that they have given out are essentially at risk. And that's how you can then incentivize the private sector to become part of the solution. So these are just a few examples that I share with you. And to believe that these are not transformative enough, let me also correct an impression that it's not only Germany and Denmark or the UK and others that have moved faster towards renewable energy infrastructure. Just a few years ago, people said, oh, you can't go beyond 5, maybe 10, 15%, then your grid will collapse. Well, Denmark is today at over 65%, I think. Germany is close to 50%. Uruguay is at 95%. Surprise, surprise. Anybody heard of Uruguay doing the most extraordinary energy transition in less than 10 years? Have you heard of Kenya, where 92% of its electricity structure is now renewable, producing power for its citizens? This is what's happening in the world, and we have been told for far too long that the markets wouldn't support it, the private sector wouldn't invest in it, the consumers couldn't afford it. Well, let's look at the facts. And I give you these just to give you a little bit more hope that the climate emergency is not yet one to which you should respond with fatalism. Things can happen much faster than anybody would have predicted markets would respond to. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman over there.
Yeah, thank you so much. This works, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So my question to you is that last week, the former president of Colombia stated that the current focus on Ukraine is driving a lot of attention away from these other pressing issues. Do you share that assessment? Do you think that, a Western inability to walk and chew gum at the same time is contributing to an inaction, or do you think it's just complacence? Thank you.
Could you tell us who you are, please?
So my name is Carl. I'm in the International Development Program, second year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did I understand you correctly that I haven't heard that quote now, but the former president of Colombia said that we should not do what?
No, he criticized the. He stated that the current focus on Ukraine, especially in Europe and the US, is causing.
When I began my lecture this afternoon, I reminded you what our potential to act actually is if you want to measure it in financial terms. So I remind you again of this figure of $450 trillion. I think what is playing out here is more a sense of, are we measuring with two yardsticks? I don't have to mention the $100 billion on climate only. I can talk to you about, the fact that the OECD to this day collectively only provides 0.33% of their gross national income for ODA. And even that is a distorted figure because a significant share of that is actually recycled back into their economies. For instance, millions and millions of UK pounds are now spent on hotels to accommodate refugees in the UK. The OECD, by some strange decision, made this legal, that you're allowed to use money that is intended for development cooperation to up to 10% to be redirected towards your own country to cover refugee costs. So I think what the president of Colombia is referring to. I think I would be surprised knowing him that he would question why the Ukraine has become such a central.
I don't think he did that.
Right.
It was more about that it drives attention away from it
and I think
address multiple crises at the same time.
And I think he has a point because the readiness and willingness of, let's say, Europe, the United States, Japan to respond to the war in Ukraine sits alongside the wars in many other parts of the world. So depending on who you are and where you are right now, things look strange sometimes, difficult to understand. And I think part of what I have experienced myself, working in New York in the midst of the cauldron, so to speak, of all these very sensitive perceptions of what is either fair or just or hypocritical, is that people need to take a moment and step back and understand each other. For Europe, it is a shock to have a major war with a P5 Security Council member unfolding in the midst of Europe in 2022, 2023. That shock clearly means that a lot of energy is, political energy, economic energy directed towards that. But Europe has realized, and I think this is the good thing, that as it began to, trying to engage the rest of the world, it had to also recognize that the rest of the world hadn't ceased existing. In fact, the rest of the world is in deep trouble after the pandemic, with the shocks on grain prices, on energy prices. And therefore, the question now is Europe going to essentially exhaust itself in its own narrative with helping Ukraine, ultimately at the expense of also being a credible and trusted part of countries that are equally suffering significantly from a war that has nothing to do with them, in inverted commas, but is affecting their economies, their citizens. I think we need a lot more wisdom. I think we also need to challenge, and again, I would urge you here, don't believe what you're being told. Our ability to do more with developing countries while also addressing the war on Ukraine is something that I think we will see play out very soon, because Europe, without the rest of the world willing to recognize what it means to be in this conflict, I think would create schisms that we would not recover from.
I will be very cheeky and use the opportunity to say that I spent all last weekend in the Munich Security Conference promoting that we stop talking about the rest of the world, because it's this, and I see the difficulty in addressing all this multitude of countries, very different in size and geography, that also have the aspiration. So a challenge to him is, how do we refer to the world with a bit more nuance than saying this is the rest of the world? Sorry for being cheeky.
No, it's good.
Sorry for being cheeky. Lady over there.
Hello. Thank you for being here. So I'm studying environmental policy master, and I would have some questions about where financing is going towards, like in the sense of what type of solutions are we financing, and are they truly sustainable on the long term? Because I'm asking some questions. Let's take, like, for instance, courses I have around agriculture or water. We can often say that actually the solution is not always in technology, and that it's much more of a governance problem often. For instance, with water, that it's just not well distributed, and that we need stronger governance. And I'm wondering to what extent that actually requires a lot of money, because technology solutions are very expensive, like desalination plants, or like, I'm just trying to think concretely. So I was wondering what your opinion is on what are we actually financing? Is it truly sustainable on the long term? And are there any assessment mechanisms in place to evaluate that?
Thank you.
Very good question. And I think my simplest way of answering is that working with nature, which, for example, is investing in a watershed. If you invest in a watershed, you know, in most places on Earth, you actually increase the hydrological flows. So that is a nature-based solution. And for instance, investing in wetlands can equally be a fantastically efficient way of generating clean or producing clean water, so to speak. And there are many examples of that. And therefore, investing in those critical infrastructure assets, and I deliberately use that term because I think we often talk about infrastructure.
Yeah.
In all we think about is roads and railways and power lines, our forests, our wetlands, our soils. This is the ecological infrastructure of our economy. And the way we can generate investments in there is obviously frontier territory. When I was the head of UNEP, I can share with you that I worked very hard on bringing economic concepts into the environmental, scientifically focused description of phenomena, of nature destruction. For some, this was very provocative. How can you put a price tag on nature? And there is a wonderful colleague of mine, you might know him also, Pavan Sukhdev, who was one of the core authors of the Green Economy Report and also some reports on biodiversity, who said that, if only bees could send you invoices, you would be surprised how many billions of dollars you would pay a year just for pollination services. So it's not to reduce nature to essentially a cash value, and the Task Force on Nature-Related Disclosure, TNFD, that UNEP and UNDP and others in the private sector are currently facilitating, is an attempt to try and connect economics and payment for ecosystem services in a more transparent way. And it's not the equivalent of privatizing nature, but each one of us every day is essentially a freeloader, right? We take advantage of nature every day, whether what you breathe, what you drink, or you are paying for services. So technology comes in because in some parts of the world, water is now scarcity. It's just a reality. With 8 billion people on the planet, even in Central Europe, we are facing water scarcity scenarios. We have to start investing in technology. Sometimes it's simply repairing our sewage systems or our water pipelines because we lose 40% of the water at great cost. Sometimes it is about recycling water. There are cities in the world that recycle their water average 7 to 8 times now, which may put you off drinking water from the tap, but let me reassure you it's perfectly clean water. And in that sense, technology and the ability to invest in nature, I think, are going to be part of understanding how we address this increasing challenge of sustainable consumption. Now, the default that we have observed around the world is sometimes, you mentioned distribution of water. There is a very well-known river, I don't know if there are any Australians here in the room, but called the Murray-Darling Basin. Australia already ran into the problem about 20 years ago that it needed the water for the city to keep the urban population going. But in fact, the farmers own the water rights. So the Murray-Darling Basin Commission was established, and essentially a water trading market was put in place where farmers could trade the use of their water to the city. And lo and behold, the amount of money the city would pay for their water was 2 to 3 times more than they would earn from using the water on their field. So a distribution through a market mechanism was put in place. But if you go to the Sahel, there's nothing to trade there. I mean, you either have access to water or you have none, and you live or die by this. And therefore, I want us also to keep in mind there are areas in which markets or technology can solve a problem. There are areas where access to water is a fundamental right. And therefore, when in the 1980s and 1990s, the World Bank and many thought that, we should privatize water supply and water management because it's more efficient, ran ultimately into a complete concrete wall, because you cannot privatize something that any of us in the room here after 3 or 4 days could not live without. And this is, let's say, the arena in which you as an environmental policymaker will ultimately have to test the boundaries of what is the optimal way of dealing with this. Is it regulation? Is it incentives? Is it new markets that you create? But all of these tools work, and they are proven to work. We just need to have the courage to challenge those who say, no, this is how it's done. This is how it's always been done, which is never the right.
Thank you very much. Gentleman over there.
Yes. Hi, my name is Konstantin. I'm from the Economic Policy Program, and I have a question regarding China. So recently, I would say recent cases like Sri Lanka and Zambia kind of have shown the unwillingness of China to work towards multilateral solutions in terms of solving sovereign debt crisis. So in essence, my question would be, how do you get China to the negotiation table, and what are current efforts taken in that direction? Thank you.
Right. Now, this is obviously a tough question for a United Nations official to be answering on the podium of Sciences Po, but I'll give you a very frank answer to it. It may surprise you that China is actually part of the negotiations of Zambia's debt at the moment. Sorry, there you are, right. And in that sense, it was the first country China signaled that it is willing to be part of a more global approach to debt. China remains fundamentally concerned about being asked to become part of debt rescheduling when it believes that the World Bank and international financial institutions should equally be also accountable, because the World Bank, you may be as broke as you are, the first one who will get their money collected is the World Bank or the international financial institutions. There is some logic to that, let's be clear. There is also a problem there, and this is something that obviously at the moment is at the heart of some of the reluctance. But there's also another view of this. China's lending and investments are not as publicly available for the rest of the world to know about. So there are obviously quite a number of countries, for example in the G7, who are saying we're not going to put our money into solving the debt problem simply to have the countries then repay the debt to China first. So this is part of bringing more transparency and also more accountability into the world's financial system, whether you are a G7 country or indeed the Chinese economy that is looking at its future markets. There's obviously a lot more politics also involved here, and I don't need to go into that right now, but China has been aggressively expanding its engagement across the world in many developing countries, bringing welcome investments in infrastructure, and not only in some of the cliched large football stadia or airports. Renewable energy infrastructure is today part of China's investment also. So I think we will probably have to wait and see how the geopolitics evolves over the next years. I think right now both China and the West writ large are more on a course of confrontation or mutual doubt, which makes it very difficult to find common ground. But let me again assure you, in the IMFC, the committee, for example, of the IMF, there are also very frank discussions amongst the members of that committee that ultimately decide the policy of the IMF. And I think there is every hope that if we are to strengthen the role of our international financial institutions in bringing together countries with very different interests, we are more likely to come to a solution than if one side or the other blames a problem entirely on the other, because it's not borne out by reality. But I think China itself, and this is my last point, has every reason right now to rethink some of its financing and investments in particularly developing countries, because many of them have proven to be not necessarily as financially profitable and therefore easy to repay those loans. And some developing countries signed up with essentially surrendering a part of their infrastructure if they're not able to service the loan. You cross a certain political line and suddenly a loan becomes a national political issue. So there is a lot of learning of lessons and rethinking right now. But let me also be clear. In Europe at the moment, I think we underestimate how significant China's ability to mobilize capital for development and investments will be to enable a continent with soon 1.5 billion people to invest massively in infrastructure development. If Africa is able to sustain its 1.5 billion people with an economic development perspective, the next 20 to 30 years require trillions of dollars of investment, and part of that will not come only from within the African continent. And therefore, one way or another, the G7, the G20 world becomes integral also to the investment of development on the African continent.
Well, I think this was substantive. I hope you understood that you can still be substantive and politically sensitive. The gentleman over there.
Good evening. My name is Adrian. I'm from Germany and I'm studying my first year international development here at SIA. Thank you very much for your speech today. That was very insightful. And I actually have two questions for you. So the first one relates to the Bretton Woods system. You said that we need a reform because it's not working the way it's supposed to be right now. And I was wondering if you could explain in detail how we should reform the Bretton Woods system and how do we actually convince, in particular, the rich countries of this reform, since they have they're the biggest shareholders of institutions such as the World Bank. My second question goes back to the use of capital. So let's say that there's enough capital provided. What are the highest priorities, in your opinion, for investments when it comes to new stimulus plans? And how do we actually ensure that the money is being used efficiently, not wasted due to structural weaknesses or other problems on the ground?
Thank you. You want to? Okay, go, please.
Thank you. I guess my question went back to the Bretton Woods system again. I didn't really understand whether the stimulus plan is what you were saying, an update of, or like a new financial architecture, or the Bretton Woods 2.0. But I don't understand how that's being done when what we're doing is doubling the paid-in capital of the World Bank. So I don't mean my question to be provocative, but also yes. So thank you.
Which one then?
Thank you.
Look, I mentioned earlier on, there are many trains on multiple tracks that are all pointing towards essentially Bretton Woods 2 means, update an international financial architecture that was created after the Second World War. I mean, this was an entirely different era. Many developing nations didn't yet exist in inverted commas as independent nations. Colonialism was rampant. Destruction, in Europe and other parts of the world was significant. So the whole geopolitical and geoeconomic, as you also referred to in your introductory remarks, setting was a different one. The interdependence, one can debate because there are some very interesting academic analysis of how much global trade proportionally to the global GDP was actually happening during the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, the late 19th century, because of the way that colonial periphery and center were essentially very much interdependent. But in today's world, we also have a developing world that is no longer a taker of decisions by others. We have a world in which, emerging economies today are very significant players. In fact, China, India, whether the largest economy, the largest, most populous country, and these were 20, 30 years ago still sort of science fiction in the minds of some. Well, here we are. It's a world that looks very different. I don't necessarily want to prejudge where the Bretton Woods reform will go. I mean, some of the examples I gave today were specifically on leveraging the Bretton Woods balance sheet. And when you ask me what is more important, the paid-in capital, or is it the ability to use some of the instruments that we spoke about? Let's be very frank, the issue on capital is essentially so controversial because if you were to increase the capital, maybe other countries would suddenly become bigger shareholders. And that is not comfortable for those who currently are the dominant shareholders. The same reason the Security Council of the UN is not being reformed because the UN is stupid, but because some member states have no reason whatsoever to change the status quo. And this is one impasse. Now, when the Treasury Secretary of the United States, Janet Yellen, suddenly steps forward and said, we need World Bank reform. And when you look at the proposals, and please do take a look at what David Malpass and have now put out, there are a series of proposals that are now being interrogated. This is complex, it's political, but it's actually quite significant. And in that sense, I think we may end up with a different shareholder structure, but we may also end up with challenging this notion that you can only retain your AAA rating if you lend as you have lent for the last 76 years, which is challengeable, has been challenged by experts. And who says that a AAA rating is the only way that a public financial institution should function? Why not AA rating? There are different views. 11 developing countries have just written a letter to the World Bank saying we don't want to lose the AAA rating because it'll make our borrowing more expensive. But how on earth are we going to finance the $3 to $4 trillion that we need the SDGs implemented, or the climate change investments that are needed, particularly in poorer countries? So these are the drivers of the reform discussion, and there are many different concepts at play at the moment. And the stimulus plan, just to answer your question also, no, it's not a Bretton Woods 2.0. The Secretary General has called for a Bretton Woods 2.0. In the meantime, how can I put it, analogous to somebody else's metaphor, the financial house is on fire, so we need to do something quickly and right now, which is why he's suggesting a number of essentially financial policy decisions that allow us to mobilize this liquidity. But the deeper structural reform is something that Mia Motley and the Bridgetown Agenda and others are now articulating, and I think we will see also in Paris in June some of those ideas coming to the fore. So watch this space, and I hope I've answered your questions.
Thank you very much. So we'll go over there. We are at the last 10 minutes of the conference, so if you could be concise, that would be good, so that Achim has the possibility to answer all of your questions.
So good evening. My name is Celine, and I study international governance and diplomacy. So thank you very much for the presentation. And my question has actually just been partly addressed, but I nevertheless wanted to ask you, given the recent announcements of the presidency of the World Bank, I was interested in your perspective on this, and maybe more specifically, if this would make you hopeful for the future, not necessarily only for the climate crisis, but also for the institutions in itself. Thank you.
You know, the World Bank has become an anchor institution in our international financial system, but particularly also in our ability to create shared interests in the way that we invest in development. And here, let me preface my deepest conviction that also in the way that I try to lead with my team now, the UN Development Program, that we are far beyond the age of development aid. I continue to believe that multilateralism is fundamentally dependent on a contemporary view of development cooperation. The 2030 Agenda, the SDGs, remember, adopted in 2015, were referred to by the then Secretary General as a declaration of interdependence. I'm deeply convinced that in the way that an institution such as the World Bank needs to function in the future is premised precisely on this ability to multiply the resources of those able to have some spare cash, 0.33% of their gross national income at current levels, to put in an institution that multiply that and create access at a far higher scale to those countries who are not able to access that capital. It's a fundamental development proposition, cooperation proposition. And equally, when we are talking about, for instance, climate change, people often think that if you were to invest money on accelerating access to energy on the African continent and perhaps put a grant element in there so Africa could pivot to clean and affordable access to electricity. Remember, 600 million people still don't have access to electricity in Africa. That somehow this is charity, or that somehow this is taxpayers' money that should be spent here. It's a co-investment. I deeply believe that we are in an era where we need to understand the way our global economy works through not only the lens of the financial system, but inequality, leaving too many people behind, creating the context in which state structures collapse because they cannot provide basic services. Look at many Sahelian countries where citizens essentially do not experience the nation state anymore in terms of education, health, infrastructure, justice and police systems. That is the context against which an institution like the World Bank either needs to evolve so it remains material and at a greater scale to the nature of the development cooperation proposition right now. I remain optimistic because I think the World Bank is in many ways a prism through which the world can think about how it actually co-invests, how it finds shared interest. You know, we speak a lot of values in our world today, when really what we're saying is my value is different from yours, therefore I don't like you, I don't trust you, I will not work with you. Multilateralism is very much rooted in the Charter of the United Nations. It is normative, absolutely, as is the Declaration of Human Rights. But the starting point of multilateralism is not mutual love, and it's not nations united. It's actually the opposite. And therefore, I often try to say to people, start with where your shared interests are, and hopefully from there you can grow shared values. The other way around, you very quickly create a dead end. Now, the presidency of the World Bank obviously will be decided in the next few months. I think the president of the World Bank is an extremely important position, and my only appeal would be that, if it is unlikely that that position will become more open in terms of its appointment, may the Global South and may Europe be more discerning in what they agree to rather than simply go along with it, because that has at times, and I don't speak to any particular tenure, sometimes severely hurt the World Bank.
Let me also being a bit cheeky, maybe wish that for the first time in history we see a woman as the head of the World Bank, but only being very, very, very cheeky. Over to you, please.
Good evening. My name is Masha. I'm studying also the Master in International Governance and Diplomacy, and this is my final semester. In my last semester, I did my internship at UNDP in the Division of Sustainable Development Goals. And in one of the events in SDG Action Zone in September 2022, Jeffrey Sachs was speaking, and he basically proposes very interesting ideas and pathways on how to reform the financial system. I'm sure you know more about his policies and his work more than I do. What I know, what makes him so valuable is that he started his career in Russia, working in Russia and analyzing the Russian transition of the economy. And in, I think, 1988, 1990, he already wrote, during the collapse, he already wrote about debt relief and conditionalities, and he published it for the US government. And he was also an advisor to Ban Ki-moon. So what do you think about his proposals, and how much say does he have, how much policy impact? Because he's a professor at Columbia University. And my second question is, from an academic side, you mentioned that maybe climate fatality is not necessarily helpful, but from an academic side, us as university students, for example, game theory or doing backward induction, econometric models, what do you think is the most helpful from an academic side rather than a practical side? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Maybe if you agree, Achim, we collect all the remaining two questions, and then we give you the final word. Please.
Absolutely. Hello. Thank you for this great talk. So I'm Alma. I'm studying management and sustainability, and I'm also employee of IFD. And so my question regards the ratings agencies. Somewhat, are the ratings agencies a part of the cycle of debt crisis, and do they condition the development of developing countries to the priorities of financial institutions which are Western-led? And in that sense, do they reduce the independence of countries by not providing them access to credit?
Thank you very much. And the final question to you.
Hi, my name is Antonella. I'm in the International Energy Masters. I'm from Argentina, so believe me, I'm familiar with the concept of debt crisis. My question is, there are some topics that are just not part of the conversation in developing countries, for instance, energy transition. In fact, in Argentina, we have elections this year, and none of the politicians who might be running are really speaking about that topic. So my question is, what role can international financing institutions play in kind of like diverting investment to energy transition purposes when societies of those countries are not really asking this from their politicians? And this is, I mean, just because they have so many other pressing needs.
Right. Very quickly, Jeff Sachs is a friend. He's an amazing academic. He has been at the forefront of, rethinking development. I think in so many ways, he is a very brave and courageous person. And in fact, the origins of this SDG stimulus can actually be traced to a conversation that he, Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General, and I and a couple of others, including UNDP, had about a goal. I think in the way that Jeff Sachs sometimes approaches some of these development challenges, then becomes a very fundamental, but to some extent closed reform agenda. I think it is for each of you to judge when you read his work, whether you find yourself more on his approach to reform or other approaches, where we in the United Nations, in a sense, have to take an idea of a grand design we then have to land it in the reality of the political spaces that are here now. So Jeff would always rightly criticize lack of ambition, and others criticize Jeff for bringing issues to the table that fall off the table before they've even been discussed. I personally think we would, and the world would be a lot poorer if it were not for the kind of challenges and the kind of big thing that colleagues like Jeff Sachs bring to the development debate. And in that sense, I salute him for it, because I take some of that inspiration in the way that I do my work in running an organization such as the United Nations Development Program. But I hope you will understand that I think to comment on, the veracity, the validity of certain aspects of his work is difficult in a setting like this. One would have to discuss this in more detail. But he remains a very audible and very powerful voice, and I would urge you to read his works, because you will find in there a great deal of precisely what I also try to convey to you tonight. Do not take dogma for what it is, the truth. Just take it for a certain way of looking at things, and your training as students, whether you then become academics or managers or politicians or public civil servants, is to continuously use those skills to challenge precisely what is traded as accepted wisdom. And sometimes come in very different directions. I remember Margaret Thatcher and her "there is no alternative." I mean, it was her second name, then it became Tina. And the UK debated for a decade whether there was no alternative or not, and yet a great deal of change was happening at that time. Let me also say that, in my remarks earlier on in qualifying what economics is, I'm not disqualifying either game theory or any other school of thought, or indeed the econometric foundations of economic policy making. I studied economics at university, and rational expectations was, the school of thought, particularly of my economics professor. My only advice to you is, these are all tools. They are sometimes methodologies, they are tools, they are analytical instruments. The minute we equate the outcomes of what essentially are, a bucket of things thrown into a hopper, and taking that which comes out as the only answer, you have forgotten what economics is really about, which is human beings making decisions under very different circumstances. And being able to understand the economy of the poor is fundamentally different from understanding the economy of a hedge fund manager. And again, if you think about GDP, we are now in the United Nations, led by the Secretary General, leading towards his Summit of the Future next year, a fundamental effort to GDP, because GDP is not an invalid analytical instrument, but it is so narrow that it has distorted decision-making for well over 4 generations now in economic policy making. And just to give you an idea, the GDP of the poor, again an idea that Pavan Sukhdev was very much at the forefront of socializing, can look very different to the GDP of an average statistical Indian citizen, because the GDP is 90% dependent on ecological infrastructure, on the land on which they produce, on the water which they get from maybe the forest or the river, while the GDP of an Indian citizen, taken as an average, is fundamentally different. This is why economics, always has to be reminded that it is a social science in which people's behavior, ability to act, ultimately can influence how decisions are made, and it is not the laws of physics or its cousin. Just very quickly, the ratings agencies. Extremely disappointing during the pandemic, because as the United Nations then tried to engage them in dealing with the fact that countries were struggling to find the fiscal means with which to respond to COVID-19, the rating agencies point blank refused to even engage. They've got a wonderful business. They live essentially of a narrow subscriber base that determines the riskiness of the vast majority of the world's population. Now, it's a service. People are paying for it, so it has a value. But what I also think we are now increasingly able to do is for developing countries to increasingly provide a more profound assessment of their actual risk profile. Because remarkably, what rating agencies do is essentially judge a country's creditworthiness by the risks to an investor's return. and with artificial intelligence and the ability to far better interrogate an actuarial science, by the way, which is what insurance practitioners use to assess risk. UNDP now has an insurance and risk finance facility precisely because we want to help countries use the latest actuarial science with artificial intelligence to reprice risk. The risk, for example, for a micro health insurance program, or the risk of an economy like Kenya or Botswana borrowing money on the capital markets. And we are convinced that we can actually bring down that risk profile if we break, in a sense, the rating monopoly of just 3 or 4 rating agencies. And again, I want to be very clear, this is not to critique that rating agencies in an imperfect world of information have provided a valuable service. But at a certain point, they have also priced entire consumer groups or indeed entire economies out of the financial market, and that is simply unacceptable. And this is also true in particular when you look at the need perhaps to have a sovereign rating platform created that is depoliticized and more accurate in actually measuring the risk that is there. It's an area I think that deserves research and more attention. Let me also say that the role that international financing institutions can play, I think that was Antonella's question, I think an enormously important role. I mean, much of what UNDP does every day, you know, we have 22,000 staff working in 170 countries. We are an institution that every day is helping countries to look for development choices and new pathways that it can decide for itself, whether it is the energy transition. And, you know, we are the largest implementer of climate change related projects in the entire United Nations system. We're in fact the number one partner the developing countries choose in the Green Climate Fund, or number 2 or 1 in the Global Environment Facility, in the Multilateral Fund or the Montreal Protocol, because we're an institution that works alongside countries, not by dictating to them what the terms of their loans are, but by helping them to exercise agency in national development. It is a fundamental principle, I think, in which we can use international institutions where essentially accessing capital is not immediately a license to tell a country that this is the only way you will develop. And let me also say, because this is important, we often, and I was asked this question by a journalist in response to the SDG stimulus, yeah, but how are you going to make sure that the rest of the world, I use that now in inverted commas, namely the developing world, doesn't run away with this money, that money isn't wasted? And I sometimes wonder, you know, in which world do people live? I mean, some of the boldest SDG bonds that have been raised on capital markets have been raised by developing countries. And I mentioned Uruguay earlier on, which is a remarkable little economy, but is a giant in terms of sustainable innovation. They launched last year, and we were simply partners to accompany them in that. A sustainability-linked performance bond, which basically pegged its forward and its carbon emissions reduction to the interest rate that it would pay. If it exceeds those commitments, its interest rate goes down. If it fails to meet those commitments, its interest rate goes up. These are the new dynamic instruments of, you know, a green or a SDG bond market in which we have invested a lot of energy also with UNDP, because we believe in a more sovereign way in which to resource national development financing. So I hope these examples give you a sense that there is a great deal we can do. Sometimes we're bringing grant capital to experiments. Sometimes we're bringing what we do largely with UNDP, a global network of development best practices, developing countries across the world. We connect them and allow them to make wiser decisions. And on that note, I end by just perhaps reminding you of one very influential person, both on UNDP and its Human Development Report and its Human Development Index, but certainly to me also as a development economist, and that is Amartya Sen. I hope that most of you have heard of him. If you have not, please at least Google him and have a look at some of his fundamental tenets of economic thinking about development. In a nutshell, development is about freedom. And I think much of what I described today may seem a long distance from such a prosaic way of talking about development, but that's precisely what I try to address this evening. Dear Dean, thank you so much for the privilege of being here. Thank you all for staying so long, and have a good night.
Thank you very much to all of you. I hope Achim has been convincing enough about how the United Nations, this organization that sometimes gets a lot of flack, it's acting, it's working, it's developing, it's organizing, and it's structuring a serious debate about debt. Thank you very much, Achim, for all these great ideas, and to all of you, watch this space, more to come in the month of March. Thank you.